I'd like to go back to the time when we first met each other in the States. We were 10 young, virile Americans from various parts of the United States. There were 6 Protestants, 2 Jews, and 2 Catholics. And we worked together beautifully, and eventually after our training we arrived here in Seething, and we finished 35 missions. And coming back here is very emotional and brings back a lot of memories.
On behalf of the 448th Bomb Group, I lay this wreath at this monument for the purpose of showing that we honor them just as they honor us.
When they first started the airfield, I think I was about 14, 15 years old. And then they came in, what, 43? I was about 18, 19, somewhere in there. I worked in Norwich at Siemens at the time, and my husband used to, my boyfriend at the time used to meet me from a flight when he came in from Norwich, and he would go to sleep on the bus while and everybody kidded me because he was sleeping. I remember, well, I shouldn't say this, but I stood up a guy when he came back for me. I was working I had to change and go to Coleman's then, and this guy kept begging and begging me to go out with him, and I wouldn't go. Finally, one day I said, okay, I'll meet you, and we'll go to the show, or the pictures, rather. And he says, well, I left him, and I let him stand at the bottom of the bus depot, and I went in the other end, so I missed him because he was here. I'm May Vincent Finch, I guess, and I used to live in Seething. I grew up in Seething. I went to school in Seething. And I left in 1946, married and left.
I'm George Finch. I was raised in Idaho, and I learned to be a machinist just before I joined the Air Force.
Good, all right. Hello, friends. How are you doing? Hello, how are you? Morning, morning, morning. And you. Morning, 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 morning.
Over over here were all kinds of engineering, photography, ordnance of various buildings, and the living quarters are way over on the other side. So this is a marvelous job redoing this.
Yes. Just cut out half of the page. If you said anything that was...
You even mentioned something.
Yeah. I mean, I got letters that just had whole half a page cut out. Just
Now,
little
see, the
clips.
officers did the censoring.
Yeah.
I don't know what they're.
That was quite a job.
Everybody looking this way, please.
Right.
But I remember checkers.
Do you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even I always wondered why it was called striped ass 8, and if I remember checkers.
I don't remember one like that. I think that was maybe one of the first ones.
I was supposed to be a navigator on a mission that took us to submarine pens just south of Denmark on the German coast. And it was over water all the way. I think I was too young to be scared, but scared eventually took over. We took a hit shortly after the target and lost our compass. And I resorted to the Astro compass, which was aboard every plane. It was a Rube Goldberg design, which was not possible to operate. I gave the bombardier the manual on how to operate it, and he was reading it to me while I was installing it. Once I got it working, it was a dream. It had no compass errors, whatever, and that's how we came home on the Astro compass. Dorfman, flight navigator, New York City.
And I think
You eat. That's your meal.
Very good. Very, very good.
We would go to breakfast first, then we would load into trucks and go to briefing. Depending on what the target was, some people got very, how should I say, very anxious, and some people would go around the corner and lose their breakfast, believe me. And from briefing then, of course, we went to the dressing room, got dressed, and we were issued our parachute. And I, as a flight engineer, would go out to the plane first and make sure that the plane was ready for combat, enough oxygen on board, all the flak suits on board, make sure everybody had their oxygen mask, and made sure we were just ready to go, and make sure the airplane was ready to go. My name is Frank DiCola. I was a flight engineer with the 448th Bomb Group, 714th Bomb Squadron.
After the war, we used to walk through this one, we used to come round here, up to here, and then we would go this way. There, these buildings down here, so we used some of them for people to live in. Here. This is 50 years later. We were friends back then, and we see each other again. Believe it or not, I wore the thing. We had the canteen, and the flashlight. That I don't know what happened to my original hat. That was a hat like that, but there was one a little bit different that we used to wear. So I couldn't fit in anymore, so I sent it to Pat Everson to put it in her museum.
I didn't know you were going to be here on duty today.
I liked to get out, and we went bike riding and enjoyed all the things I really liked. And I consider myself one of the very fortunate ones. We were crossing the French coast, a little place called Abbeville. We encountered flak, and our pilot and navigator were wounded. And out of that, well, we turned around and we made it back quite all right. But out of that, we were able to have a holiday up in Scotland. And
Hey, Ron? No, I'm going to get you one. You can't get me. Oh, well, I'll get you others too.
I think I've seen you someplace before.
My cousin's husband had brought him in to go rabbit hunting, and he was the only one that caught the rabbit, and that's how I met him after the rabbit hunt.
But we also remember them in ways which may be a little bit different from most people. It's like remembering the good-looking young lad across the table at breakfast with the sleepy eyes, ready to go on a mission. Or fixing to bicycle through the town of Seething, or the village of Seething. Or maybe to go to a dance on the base or in Norwich. Or even to go to London to see the ancient mysteries of that town. So we remember them very well. You know, our God has been real good to us to allow us to come back here and be with them today. We ask that He keep them forevermore.
crash land on my 5th mission when a Focke-Wulf 190 came out of the sun, and my plane was on a wide sweeping turn about 75 yards out of position, and they had fired a 30mm cannon into my wing, and I didn't even know they were anywhere around. It sort of felt like a blowout on a car. It's just a thud, and his left wing just veered like this, and I started doing my prayer because a big hole in the wing, and I knew it was going to blow up because it should have gotten into the gas tank, and it didn't. And some guys in the back of my crew said, "There's 4 more." So I said, "Oh my God." So I dived the plane down to gain speed and toward my group that I was out of position on, and gave it a little more gasoline, petrol, so I could regroup, but I was badly damaged. And my commander said, "Just lean it out and don't fly formation, just fly underneath for protection until you get back to your base." I made it back to base, but I wasn't quite sure that the tire was blown out, but I was pretty sure it's a possibility because it's right where the left landing gear recessed into the wing. That's where the hole was. So I landed last, which you normally would do anyway, because you don't want to have a fire and a crash and mess up the running. And so we came in with full flaps, so you get maximum drag, but also maximum lift, coming slower, and touch the left wheel down to see if it was actually blown out. If it went down, we knew it was. If it went down, it did go down, so we take off power on the right side, we put power on the bad side, and put brake on the good side, and after a while, momentum just took over. And we finally landed almost off the runway. We stayed on the runway, and it didn't flip over, and nobody was killed, nobody was injured, but it was very close. And
That's all right. We looked all right. Somebody's going to help. We were doing all right up here. You're too fast. Too fast. Better get with the program. Nice stride there, Frank. Nice stride. Like that? Yeah, you're good. Pretty good. This is Martian.
Welcome to Seething, everybody, especially the 448 veterans and all our families. It's very good to see you here. And to all you people who've never been before, you're very welcome, and do come back again anytime. The Arnold pilots, as you know, you've been here before, and you're very welcome. But thank you to everybody. I won't comment on the marching. Here on what is the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. And of course, for one or two of you here today, it's really the 52nd anniversary just about when you first met this airfield, because it was in the autumn, wasn't it, of 1943 that the first elements came here. You were so young, so enormously young, wonderful young people who were attracted to come and help sort out a terrible pickle in Europe, and made a huge contribution as a consequence. a huge contribution to the victory that first of all was attained in Europe, and then eventually, of course, many of you were taken back with a view to flying the B-29s afterwards. I hope that you will always regard Seething as your home in Britain, and very particularly this tower as a memorial to you and all that you contributed.
I'd just like to say one thing to Cater. He wanted the Arnold men right up the back of the colour guard, which we were quite happy to do, but I don't know who his marker was in front, but I was the last one in the very last contingent, and I think I changed step 24 times on the short way up.
Everlasting and loving God, with bowed heads and humble hearts, we come to this hallowed ground to give you eternal thanks. Eternal thanks for and in remembrance of the valiant lives of the 460 members of the 448 who made the ultimate sacrifice and whom you took in your loving arms so long ago. Eternal thanks for and in remembrance of those members of the 448 who cannot be with us today but have ascended to your nearer presence since the close of the war.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Brian Coleman from the Waveney Flying Group. Thank you, Brian. Now, Mr. Arthur Culf for the Arnold pilots. Thank you, Arthur. And lastly, Cater Lee for the 448th Bomb Group.
And on occasion we go underneath another group, and I was in the nose turret, and I'd look up and I'd see the bombs coming down from other planes directly above us. And I could read the numbers on them, and I thought, my goodness, one of those bombs hits us, that's it. Another thing I did before we got to the target, our bombs were safety wired with cotter pins, and I had to go out onto the catwalk between the bombs and pull out the cotter pins so that once the bombs were dropped, they would be armed, and when they hit their targets, they would explode. Ira Wells, armorer gunner, nose turret gunner, Staten Island, New York.
At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Banner bearers, order, standard.
And of course, getting into formation was always a task because, again, the weather. You climbed sometimes through solid overcast, clear up to altitude, and it was also a chore finding your group sometimes to get into formation. Of course, after you got into formation, we kept climbing till we got to altitude, which was 20 to 25,000 feet. And then we would proceed to take off for across the North Sea or the Channel, whichever was appropriate.
Navigation at treetop level is damn near impossible. We were given one landmark that if we saw it, we'd be no question whatever that we were on course. And that was a large, flat building with the name of a factory in letters 10 feet high on the roof. And I had it written down, and we all wrote it down carefully that we knew to look for it. And it was a word that meant nothing to any of us. The word was Heineken. Now, it wasn't until maybe 15 years later that I discovered what Heineken meant. When they began to bring Heineken into the United States, and I realized I better start drinking it just in memory of that mission and that checkpoint.
Yeah, point.
Please from me.
Okay, hello.
Thank
you. Got a hand up
there, yeah,
On one occasion, he walked past the navigator's table, and I noticed that somehow his oxygen hose had been disconnected from his source of oxygen, and I realized that he maybe had 20 seconds or less before he passes out, and he was headed for the open Bombays. I realized that. I disconnected myself, my oxygen, all the wires he hooked up, intercom, oxygen, electrically heated suit, grabbed him by the back of the neck as he was fainting and pulled him into the plane that he shouldn't fall out. And at the same time, I hit the intercom button and said, I need help, because I had to get back on oxygen in a hurry. So one of the other gunners came, and they put him back on oxygen, because we all had that problem of being off oxygen was a question of seconds. Now, he didn't even know it happened, because when he came to, he just thought he was a little dizzy and went on with what he had to do. He didn't find out about that until 30, 40 years later, when a conversation was being held at a reunion.
I started flying my missions August 1st, 44, and I flew seven successive missions, one after the other, 7 days straight. Then we had about 3 days rest, and we flew one every week, maybe, depending on the weather.
What would you do with your time off?
Play poker. We played poker with our time off. We were given a 48-hour pass every 6 missions we flew, and naturally most of us took off for London for 48 hours. And occasionally we would go to Seething, pub crawl, at the Mermaid. We called it something other than the Mermaid.
I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do it. You made me love you. I know the time when you are yours, you always secret. You make me happy sometimes. You make me sad.
We always had a good time with them. They were very friendly. They used to come and knock on the door in the middle of the night and ask if they could borrow some air for their bicycles because they were out of air. Or could we tell them the way back to the airfield? They were a little bit merry. And we had lots of fun, really. We picnicked together. A bunch of us would go out. We picnicked down by a brook, and in the summertime especially, and we had a really good time.
I was a group operations officer, and after VE Day, it was my job to schedule all our aircraft with their air crews and 10 additional ground personnel to be carried back to the United States. I did this chore and got everything arranged, and about 6 days before takeoff time, Colonel Westover, who was the group commander, called me in and said, Smitty Division says a flying officer has to stay on the base and close up the base and bring the rest of the ground personnel back to the States. My roommate was Colonel Thompson, who was the squadron commander of 713th Squadron. When I told him later that day Colonel Westover's decision, he said, that's great because I will fly with the crew that you had scheduled yourself. So instead of my going with that crew, he took my place. When they took off to go to Prestwick, Scotland, Colonel Miller, who was then group commander, said that he called me on the telephone and said, asked me where Tom was. That was a nickname for Colonel Thompson. And I said, he's supposed to be with you, and he said he hasn't showed up yet. Well, they had to take off from the States. I heard nothing more, but 2 days later I got a call from an RAF station up by Prestwick and said they had the crash of one of our aircraft. So I drove up there and investigated what I could. There were 20 people on board, 17 were killed. I visited the other 3 in the hospital, but one of them died.
You know, if anyone ever says why we fought the war, they should have seen those children in church today.